being like, you and I don't have to have.
All right. So I'm super close to launching. I was up till 11, well, work at 10:20, 10:30 I got it. Put the thing, the column back in the TypeScript file for this page. Um, the problem is there's a switch in the HTML and it's just showing the fingerprint, and this is not being queried. My console logs aren't going off, but I clicked it and the code that I added here fired off, and we got a transaction out. However, uh, it is not the correct transaction. Um, so type is L. Um, and my decoder in the protocol is, oh, it's not even here. It's going to be in the other thing. Yeah, decimal value 21. Right, it's confusing that for the withdrawal, and there's no channel. Um, there's no output. It's not it's not formatted for that. So those aren't actually being valid, anyways. So I'm gonna fix that, spit it out again, have a correct one. I got to deal with the case case sensitivity. Um, so I'm gonna make these like all uppercase, I guess, to keep it consistent within the protocol. The way that it's going out in the encoding is it's lowercase, so I'm gonna like standardize that. Or I could go the other way and have everything be lowercase, but uh, that's not how the IP. Something's they come out uppercase. These country codes in the IPs, IP APIs. So this is how I'm enforcing a modicum of compliance at the protocol level. And then I do a few more checks at the app level. So yeah, so that's weird. So let's put on this brilliant podcast, Theories of Everything, with Kurt Jaimungai, or Jaimungai. I'd love to go on this podcast someday, present my own theory of everything.
The same wave function for the same object. So I can describe an
Yeah,
electron
it's
with
gonna
a wave
solve
function. You
problems.
could describe an electron with a wave function, but based on the
All kinds of,
information that we have
it's
about
like
the
two
electron, if we
layers
have
of
different
brilliant
information, we can give different
screaming
quantum states for that thing.
smart. This is less smart than
So,
what she's talking.
so I think that would be a very information-based approach. And this becomes really relevant because there are these paradoxes like the Wigner's friend paradox.
Yes. If you don't mind, can you outline Wigner's friend?
Yeah, so it's this very mind-bending paradox where, let's say, okay, you're my friend, Kurt, and you go into a lab and you're going to measure, you have a qubit, so like, a quantum system that can be in one state or another, and it's an electron that can be spin up or spin down
That's
along some
amazing.
axis. And um, and
Dude,
you're going to make a
ChatGPT is
measurement
starting
and
to make
and
these stuff
say,
right, man.
the electron spin up or it's spin
It's
down.
crazy. All right, well, I didn't
But
waste too much time on this one.
I'm Wigner and I'm standing
T-1
outside the lab,
anchor
and the lab is
call.
like a completely isolated
Just
system.
fire.
So, from my perspective, quantum mechanics should tell
Yep.
me that you, as a physical system, and the electron as a physical system, if you interact, you just become entangled with each other, and you just end up in this big superposition of Kurt has seen the electron spin
This
up
takes
and the
about
electron
a
is
minute and
spin
a
up,
half to
plus Kurt
compile
has seen the electron is
the
spin
web
down and the
browser.
electron is spin down.
Right.
Transcript out
And then I can make a
npm
measurement, and then
install.
I'll find like
It's part of
one
the
of those
course.
or the other.
Thorough.
So it's a scaled up version of Schrodinger's cat. It's just instead of
Yes.
the cat, it's you. And then you have another friend who's wondering, well, what's going to happen with the
Yeah.
superposition?
Like the cat's in the box, but then Schrodinger's in a box too.
Okay.
So yeah, it's like these nested measurements, and like what you realize is like the friend can assign one state to the thing. Like the friend says the electron is spin up. That's the state. Whereas like Wigner is like, no, the electron's still in a superposition of up and down, and so is the friend. And so then you're like, well, if the quantum state is supposed to like say what the state of the electron is, whose quantum state is right? Because I have one and you have one, and they're different. So it sort of points to this fact that you probably can't treat quantum states as not relative in some sense, as being absolute, like this is the quantum state of the electron. And so different interpretations have to get around this in different ways. And so like many worlds, like Everett would just say, well, no worries, like in one universe, one outcome happens, in the other universe, the other outcome happens, and we're always going to end up in the universes where we agree on our things. And so like you just sort of sweep all the disagreements into different universes, and then it's fine. But or you could have objective collapse. People would say, well, a friend is a big macroscopic system, and when they make the measurement, the thing actually collapses. And so Wigner can't really describe it as being a big superposition because that would just be wrong.
Do you have a pet? Yeah, okay. Let's get to basically what I was going to ask is, do you have a favorite interpretation? But maybe you're about to answer that.
I'm sympathetic to Ravelli's relational quantum mechanics. But cubism, I think, would be my like preferred.
Yes.
I don't, as a journalist, like I'm supposed to be like neutral. Trying to give this classical third person story of like what's the real state of the electron, I think it's just the wrong question. And again, it just goes back to these like 17th century philosophical ideas that we have about how reality works. And so I would prefer to, not suffer from long classicality and just say, the world is quantum, and so I can write down one quantum state and you can write down another quantum state. So what cubism says is my quantum state is not a description of the thing. So if we're talking about Schrodinger's cat, and I say, I'm going to write down a quantum state that has the cat in a superposition of dead and alive. That is not a description in cubism of the cat. That tells me nothing about the state of the cat. What it tells me is about the state of my various degrees of belief about what might happen when I interact with the cat.
Okay.
So it's a very different story. It's not describing the cat, it's describing my beliefs. And then, but the sort of interesting content comes from the fact that while I can have whatever beliefs I want, my beliefs have to be related to each other in a consistent way. So it's not completely unconstrained. It's not like, well, I believe anything I want, What happens in cubism is the Born rule, which is this like sort of fundamental rule in quantum mechanics for how normally the Born rule is taken to be like how you get probabilities out of the wave function. So like you square the amplitude of the wave function and that gives you the probability. That's the Born rule. Cubism sort of mathematically rewrites the Born rule in terms of just how different probabilities for different measurements you can make on the same system relate to each other. And this is a really, really interesting move because what it says is like the difference between quantum mechanics and classical mechanics is in classical mechanics, I can measure anything of a system. I can measure its position and its momentum. No big deal. In quantum mechanics, you can't do that. There's certain measurements you can make that preclude you from making other measurements at the same time. And that ends up being like really fundamental. That's how you get the uncertainty principle and all this stuff. So that's the like central difference. And so because I can make, if I'm Wigner, I can open the lab and then say, hey, Kurt, what did you get when you measured your electron? That's one measurement I can make. Or I can measure the whole you and the electron in like a superposition basis and get an interference pattern. And so I can do these different types of measurements, but I can't do them both. And And so my
everything has
beliefs
to be
about
sort
what
of
I think
final
I'm going to
balance.
see when I do one type of measurement is constrained by how it's related to the beliefs about what I could do if I take these other measurements. And that constraint ends up being in cubism like sort of the real content of quantum mechanics. So it's just really interesting because it's a totally different way of looking at the physics.
Well, the word belief here must be used in some abstract sense. Because if I was to ask my mom, look, I have a quantum mechanical experiment. It's either going to be spin up or spin down. What are your beliefs about this? What are the probabilities you're assigning to this? She's going to cook me food, and she's going to think that I've lost my mind.
It's a good mom.
Yes, exactly. She'll have no idea what I mean. When I said the word quantum mechanics, she has no beliefs about that. I said spin up, spin down, she doesn't know. Maybe she would say 50-50, but that may just happen to be actually what the probabilities are, but it could be 75-25 or what have you. It could be 99, whatever. So what is meant when we say, look, the wave function represents our beliefs. We didn't have any beliefs about wave functions prior to wave functions being invented in the 1900s, and presumably the world was still operating prior to then. So what is meant by the word belief? Yeah, so what's sort of remarkable is it really just means belief. It means like it's a belief that you can put a number on. So I mean, that's like the bare minimum, I guess. But it really is your belief. So it could be your mom coming to it if she's willing to put some numbers on it. The thing is that the Born rule, what she has to do is say, okay, I believe, I have 90% that this would happen if I did this. I believe 10% that this would happen if I did this. And I believe 20% this would happen. But then if she plugs all those beliefs in, the Born rule is going to either say, proceed or like stop and rethink. So if it doesn't fit this equation, the Born rule is going to say, hang on, your beliefs are not self-consistent. So you're not just referring to that they don't add up to 1. You're referring to something else.
In early 2022,
it's related to the fact that they don't add up to 1. But it's, they've rewritten it in this way that they have to. Yeah, okay, so the fact that they have to add up to 1 is like the law of total probability, right? If the world were classical, that would be the whole constraint. You would just need the law of probability, total probability. The Born rule is a slight addition to the law of total probability. So it's classical probability theory plus this one extra constraint, which is like an empirical fact that comes from the fact essentially that like Planck's constant is not 0. So again, it comes from the fact that our probabilities don't add in the way that they did classically. Like that's what we see in the double slit experiment. It's like your probabilities.
Right. There's interference with the probabilities.
Yeah, they interfere. And so Richard Feynman was like, this is the whole mystery of quantum mechanics. Is like, why do probabilities not add in a classical way? It's similar to like the whole mystery of relativity is like, why do velocities not add in a classical way? So you say, okay, what I have to do to make my beliefs consistent is it has to conform to the law of total probability plus the Born rule.
Yes. Now, Amanda, I still don't see how this helps my mom. Because my mom will say, okay, Kurt, okay, son, 65-25. And I'm like, Mom, that doesn't add to 1. We'll normalize it, Mom. She's okay, I don't know what that means. And then she'll just throw out some other numbers. How is she supposed to know if it adds up to the Born rule? How am I supposed to know? It can't be belief means belief in...
It does, though. It does.
Yeah, okay, help me through this.
The amazing thing about cubism is like, they mean what they say. It really is. So the idea is, the Born rule is going to say, look, if you were betting, if you were placing bets, like think about it like you're betting on like the outcomes of all the different types of measurements you can make on this system. You're saying like, if I choose to measure position, I'm going to get this. If I choose to measure momentum, I'm going to get this. And then you're putting like a dollar amount on like each thing that you could do. If you violate the Born rule, it means you've subjected yourself to a sure loss. No matter what you do, you're going to lose money. So your only goal here is to just not have a sure loss. You want to just like adjust your bets so that you're not open to just losing no matter what happens.
Yes.
So So if your mom like comes up with some numbers and you're like, hold on, this doesn't fit, you have to, one of these has to be a little lower, let's say. And then she can search her soul. This is how Chris always says it. She can search her soul and make a decision. You know what? I'm going to put more on this one, a little less on this. She tweaks it. That's it. Nothing compels her to believe any particular thing, but quantum mechanics compels her to make her beliefs coherent with one another. And this is they emphasize this in Cubism. This is a normative rule. So this is not an ontological rule. This is not saying like this is how the world is. It's saying this is what you should do as an agent in the world who is trying to bet on the outcomes of your measurements. And that is the whole story.
Yes. Chris Fuck says, throwing some holy water, like quantum mechanics compels you. Quantum mechanics compels you. Okay, so let's imagine he's doing that to my mom. But it would take 2 years before she was to articulate by chance some set of probabilities that would happen to align with the Born rule.
Yeah.
Yet the universe is still moving and trucking along. And presumably at any given instant, we're making billions of quantum mechanical measurements and observations and so on. So this is happening under the hood. It's not just physicists in a lab writing it down. When I'm looking at you, there are many quantum mechanical effects occurring in this desk here, and same with you, and same with the people listening. So at no point are the people who are listening making beliefs about quantum mechanics consciously. In fact, some of them are finding out about quantum mechanics right now.
Yeah.
So help me understand, how does belief, conscious belief, or what we ordinarily, colloquially think of as belief, have anything to do with a quantum system?
So I think the question comes from usually seeing quantum states as being like reality or a description of reality. And then you're saying, well, like, how could reality be my beliefs, right? But here in Cubism, that's not what reality is. Your quantum states are just tools that agents use to make better gambling decisions about the measurements that they're going to make. And that's it. I mean, there's a sense in which Cubism, they say like it's a small theory. It's that nobody's saying that's what reality is. They're just saying quantum theory, that everyone is confused by quantum theory because they think quantum theory is describing reality. And quantum theory is not describing reality. It's describing how we ought to bet on our measurement outcomes. And if you're not doing a complicated like double slit experiment or something, you probably don't need to write down a quantum state, and you probably don't need to make these bets. And that doesn't mean the universe is going to fall apart. It just means you're not doing quantum mechanics. Like you're not an agent who's gambling on these things. So, okay, then you could say, well, hold on. Now we've just made this so small that like, who cares? But the deeper point is the fact that your beliefs have to be consistent with one another in this way. Something about that mathematical structure tells you about the character of the world. So you're not learning about reality from the wave function. That's not what the wave function is doing. If you want to learn about reality, you say, why should I bet this way? Why am my bets constrained in this way? That's weird. What kind of world is this such that that would be the best way to gamble on measurement outcomes? And then that's the road in to asking these kind of like deep ontological questions about reality. But the road in is not to say like, what is the wave function? What does it represent? Nothing. It represents our degrees of belief about measurement outcomes. So Cubism, the wave function is not describing reality, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't tell us something very deep about the nature of reality. So when we look at the fact that we have to organize our bets in this particular way, that's telling us something about the character of the world. So it's very similar to, like Chris Books likes to use this example of the euglena, which I think is some kind of microscopic organism, the euglena's tail. So you can look at the euglena's tail, and it's just it's just a feature of the euglena. It's not about the world. But the fact that this is a useful tool for the euglena to navigate its world tells you something about the world, like indirectly. And so the idea is supposed to be the same in cubism, that the fact that the Born rule constrains our beliefs in this particular way tells us something about the character of the world that we're having beliefs about. And so what does it tell us? Well, this is something Cubism's still trying to figure out. But the deep point seems to be that it tells us that the world is not divisible into subject and object in the way that we have thought since Descartes. So it tells us that reality is participatory in this really deep sense. It tells us that there's not just some way that things are sitting out there independent of us, but that we and the world together through these like concrete interactions, these measurement interactions, are creating something genuinely novel. Sometimes the cubists describe it as like there's a spark, there's this novel little bit of creation, almost like a little Big Bang every time there's a measurement. And so it's not that, like Kurt, when you asked, wasn't the universe just going on, before we were making bets and writing down these wave functions? So the wave functions are not the reality. And that the cubists would say, like, that's the mistake these other interpretations are making. It's not the reality, but the fact that we should structure our beliefs in this way does tell us that the reality has this character of subject and object not being like neatly and unambiguously divisible. So that does tell us something very deep. And then, Cubism is hoping to go on with this kind of ontological project of trying to say more about the nature of that reality. But it gives this participatory story, because you can't say, when you make a measurement, you can't say that you're revealing something that was already there. You're not finding out what was already there. You're participating in the creation of that thing. But the key is also, it's not in you, right? It's in the interaction between you and the world. That's where the novelty is happening. It's not in the subject, because again, the subject and object can't be like neatly divided in this way. And so some people hear about cubism, they say, oh, it's solipsistic because it's all about beliefs, and it's not just anyone's beliefs, it's my beliefs, right? So if I write down a wave function, it's my beliefs, and they don't have to be the same as yours. And so people think that, they hear that and they think like, because they're so used to thinking of the wave function as like representing reality, it's like, well, then it's only my universe and only your universe. And like, no, that's not what's happening. It's my beliefs and your beliefs. It's my wave function and your wave function. But what arises through measurement is something shared between me and the world when I make a measurement. And what arises through measurement is something shared between you and the world when you make a measurement. And then if you and I are interacting with each other, we're creating something shared together. So there's this participatory story. And sometimes I like to think about, Wheeler used to tell this anecdote that I love. Just going back to John Wheeler for a second. So Wheeler liked to tell this story about playing a game of 20 questions. So he tells the story that he was at a dinner party and they're playing 20 questions. They would send someone out of the room and they would decide on like a word, and the person would come back in and start asking yes or no questions, and they would have to have 20 questions to be able to guess the word. So then it was Wheeler's turn to leave the room, and he leaves, and when he comes back in, he leaves the room, and it takes a very long time, it seems, for them to decide on the word. And so then he goes back into the room and he starts guessing. He says, is it an animal? And they say, no. And then he says, okay, is it green? And the next person thinks for a second and says, no. He says, is it white? And the next person thinks and they say yes. And this goes on, and he's noticing that the answers are taking longer and longer each time. And finally he says,
I'm right, GPT.
Is it a cloud?
Very agreeable.
And the person, thinks for a long time, and then everyone bursts out laughing. They say yes. And it turns out that what the game was when he left the room, they decided that they weren't going to pick a word. they were just going to answer questions on the fly. But the rule was that whenever they answered a question, they had to have something in mind that was consistent with all the previous answers, so that if he like challenged them, they would be able to like come up with a word that this thing could be. So for Wheeler, this like was the like a perfect example of what happens in quantum mechanics, because the point is the word cloud didn't exist before he started asking questions. But he didn't come up with the idea that it was a cloud because he was asking questions in response to the answers he was getting from the people. But they didn't come up with it either because they would have given different answers if he had asked different questions. And so the word cloud was this sort of participatory creation that came about between, the person making the measurement, the person asking questions of the world, and the world responding in turn. And so it's like, in the end, shared between all of them.
That's super interesting.
Right? So this is Wheeler's idea of like a participatory universe. And this is really the kind of ontology or the kind of reality that Cubism gives you, because you're asking questions about the world. And yes, you're structuring your wave function in terms of your beliefs and all of that. But that's not what's happening in the actual measurement. In the actual measurement, you're asking a question of the world. The world's responding back, and the two of you together are like creating something new. So that's the real story that like Cubism is trying to tell. And the whole thing about beliefs is just a way of telling that story really, really consistently. And I guess the other thing I should add is, in terms of the Bayesian part of the story, yes, it's true that like your beliefs can be anything you want as long as they're consistent and according to the Born rule, but they're informed by all your prior experiences. So the whole idea of Bayesian probability is that you make a measurement, you get an outcome, and then you update your probabilities that you're going to assign. So you update your beliefs in reaction to what the world has given you. So the interesting thing here is like in terms of solving like the quote unquote measurement problem is that like other interpretations, what they would call the collapse of the wave function, in Cubism, it's just an agent updating her beliefs, right? So she gets an outcome, changes her probabilities. That's it. That's the whole story of like the collapse of the wave function. It's not a big deal because the wave function doesn't refer to reality. But that means that like your beliefs, even though like you are free to believe whatever you want as long as they fit together in this way prescribed by the Born rule, your beliefs are not subjective in the sense of being like just, made up in your head, because they arise from your whole history of like prior concrete interactions with the world. And so in some sense, the beliefs already straddle that subject-object divide because they already incorporate these interactions that straddle that divide themselves. And so I think, it's personalist, and it's important to say that, but it's also important to realize that like those beliefs, you're not just like coming up with them in your head. You're interacting with the world and updating in response to that. And then like the last thing I should say about Cubism is it's not just the quantum state assignment that you give to a system that's personalist, but the outcome is personal too. So again, this like is what helps us get out of a Wigner's friend paradox, is like you can make a measurement and get an outcome, and it doesn't mean that outcome is true for me when I'm over here and I'm Wigner. So outcomes are personal, just like quantum state assignments are personal. And so in Cubism, like to be consistent, you end up with all these levels of like personalism. But again, you don't want to think of it as being in some agent's head. It's not like the world's in your head. It's you're interacting with the world in a very real way. And the outcome is something shared between the people participating in that interaction, which is like you and the world, or you and another agent if you're acting on each other. But anyone who's not in that interaction, like Wigner standing outside, this is not, an outcome for Wigner. So it's personal in that sense.
Okay, let's go through a side door. With all these different interpretations of quantum mechanics, there are other foundational issues at the heart of quantum field theory, which is said to be the deeper theory. Have you heard of some interpretation of quantum mechanics solving any of the foundational problems in QFT?
Any of the interpretations?
Yeah, any of them. I haven't seen any personally, but I don't know about the relationship between interpretations of quantum mechanics and the foundational issues of quantum field theory.
In QFT, it's almost like you're already telling a kind of realist story about like what's happening in the world. Cubism wants to just be like measurement. We're talking about measurement. That has to be the foundation of anything you're talking about. So I would think like, well, I don't know. Tell me what you have in mind.
Well, actually, one of the interpretations, so Penrose makes some claims about quantum gravity. So then that has to say something about quantum field theory. But then there are other issues like how do we rigorously define the Feynman path integral? Or what about existence of mass gaps or problems with renormalization? And it doesn't seem to me like interpretations of quantum mechanics have any bearing here. But it seems like they should, to me, because quantum mechanics is at the higher level than quantum field theory. Quantum field theory is more foundational. So we're stuck up here trying to interpret when we should be over here interpreting.
It's like the interpretation is going to set the terms for what you're counting as real, what you're counting as... It's going to sort of set like the really, really fundamental terms in which like any theory that you talk about in physics then has to apply. Like, so for example, people talk about in quantum gravity or something like... or not even quantum gravity, like talking about like vacuum fluctuations, let's say.
Yes.
Okay. So you have like, because of uncertainty, you have vacuum fluctuations, you have pair production of particles and like, so you can tell this whole story. But really, if you're thinking in like terms of like quantum foundations and interpretations, like what are those fluctuations of, right? Because it's coming out of uncertainty. So is it fluctuations in your beliefs? Is it fluctuations in your knowledge and information? Is it like, because if you're saying it's fluctuations of a thing that's just sitting out there fluctuating, like you're already either like a Bohmian, like you've already picked an interpretation at that point. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. So the cubists would say
you got to talk about where's your the agent has to be in the story from the beginning, and what are they measuring and how are they betting on the outcomes of those measurements.
So would the cubists say that your beliefs are actually fluctuating?
No. I realize I said that, but no. They would say the fluctuations come from uncertainty, quantum uncertainty. And in a cubist story, the uncertainty comes in with the fact that you can't make certain measurements simultaneously. And I mean, that's what's happening, right? Like when you get like a vacuum fluctuation in the standard like story, it's coming about because of this non-commuting nature of like time and energy, right? So you say, oh, on really, really, really short time scales, you can get these like huge fluctuations of energy. And so, but what you're really saying, that's like, again, it's like you're just trying to tell a very realist story at that point, because what you're really saying is, if I were to measure the time, I could get this thing. If I were to measure energy, I could get this thing. And then those are related in this strange quantum non-classical way. But like the whole story has to be like, what are you actually going to measure? And you can't talk about like what some field out there is doing independent of what you're measuring.
Amanda, to get into some less, well, we'll see. It could be less hairy or more hairy ground. What is your view of consciousness?
Oh boy, that's more hairy. My view of consciousness is related to all of this.
Great.
And let me try to think of the least painful way of explaining it. To put a name to it, like the view that I find compelling is usually called the enactive. view or an
First
activism.
E,
And this is in the world of like what's
and
sometimes called like
then
4E cognition. So this is like
there's
embodied,
outside
embedded,
stability,
extended, and active.
trigger according to the TX
It's
indexes.
related to ecological psychology as well. So anything that starts with an E
Yes.
tends to fall in this camp. And so yeah, I would of the E's, I would choose inactive. But can I give a historical aside for a second?
Please.
Because I find that this really, really helps explain where I'm coming from. This idea that we have of consciousness